I think we have to be very careful with analyzing the future, because to tell you the truth, I don't know anyone who has been accurate in predicting the future. And I've lived now 78 years. So we can talk about the present. We can talk about the past, and we know very little about the past. Even it's been written, but it's been written by people that had an interest in portraying events in a certain light. A French historian, he will talk differently about Napoleon than a Russian historian, I can tell you. And the same about the Second World War, about Stalingrad. A Russian historian will have a different view than a German historian. But in general, I think it's futile to think too much about the future. I'm an economist and I'm an investor. I'm interested essentially to see how stocks move and which assets move under the current framework of political, economic, cultural conditions. At the present time, you pointed out, we have very large levels of debts, and we have an environment where until recently, say until 2020, interest rates were trending down and inflation was trending down. Maybe not as much as the Bureau of Labor Statistics was suggesting, but it was a downtrend. And now we have an uptrend in essentially inflation, in prices, and we have an uptrend in interest rates. In interest rates and inflation, we have long-term cycles. These cycles are, 40, 50, 100 years long. And we've reached a major low in the interest rate cycle in year 2020, when the 10-year Treasury was at 0.57%. This is not going to happen again. From here on, interest rates will go up, partly because of the deficits. And the deficits, they cannot be eliminated just like this. We have to increase taxation massively, or cut spending, or both. Or we have to default, is a possibility. Or we have to print money. And every government in history has opted to print money because initially it's a relatively painless measure that is not visible by the majority of people. The majority of people say, oh, prices are going up, because the American media, the dumbed-down media, will say it's Putin, and the government says, yes, it's Putin. Because of him, prices are going up. The fact is, prices are going up because of excessive money printing and fiscal deficits. And it's a tax on the system, because the fiscal deficits occur because not enough taxes are collected. So prices then go up, and that is the tax ordinary people pay. And wealthy people, the financial sector, including myself, we benefit from money printing because our assets, including precious metals and so forth, go up in value. One of the problems in economics is essentially the origin of our success in the world in the last 150 years, the industrialization, the increase in standards of living, and the increase in population. We were at 1 billion people in the world in 1850. We're now at close to 8 billion people. This has never happened before in history. You can look up any period in history. The prosperity was not the same as it is today, where essentially poor people can go into a shop and buy a bottle of Coca-Cola, which is also drunk by the richest people in the world. In other words, the difference between the richest and the poorest is on paper, not necessarily in the standards of living. Everybody has a toilet. Some have a beautiful refrigerator, like Nancy Pelosi, and other people have an ordinary refrigerator. The function is the same. You can preserve food for, say, a bit longer than just one day. That was the case previously. So we have this unprecedented prosperity in the world based on free markets and the capitalistic system that eliminated the inefficient producers and rewarded the productive producers and productive entrepreneurs. That is the key to economic success, that the inefficient industry are washed away. And there's a very good book on the subject here. You have The Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy by Joseph Schumpeter. Of course, the young people, they don't have the time to read. They have to be busy looking at TikTok the whole day. But they should read something that is very important to understand. Why capitalism is so successful and why the socialists are so envious of the capitalist success. Socialism is the ideology of envy and of jealousy. That's what it is. It wants to destroy the successful entrepreneurs. That is the worst part. And the governments and the academia, they're all on the left, all. And the ones that are on the right, they are eliminated under some excuse of racism or whatever. You know, in life, you have to be very careful of people who are dumb. They can cause a lot of unintentional damage because they pursue policies which they think are useful, but in fact are detrimental to the overall standards of living of a country. I'm not saying Trump is dumb, but the ideas he's got about global trade and about the global economic relations do not make a lot of sense. Now, he may think that he can make America great again. This is not my view. Societies move in cycles, and the US probably reached the peak of its prosperity in the late 50s, mid 60s, something like this, you know. And from there on, things began to be less rosy. It wasn't the country everybody aspired to go to anymore. I'm not sure they will be superpower, but we have to clearly realize that the world is a different world than under colonialism and under a regime of neo-colonialism after the Second World War, and that it is a different world from a world where China had no global influence, where India had no global influence, and Russia little influence except in the military sphere. Today, China exports, of course, more than the US and produces more goods than the US. In fact, their industries, cement, China produces more cement than the rest of the world combined. It's an industrial powerhouse. And if you look at the top universities in science, there's one top American university, is Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. But in most fields, the first 5 to 10 universities are in China, ranking according to the quality of the university and the technological advancement. There are interviews about American businessmen in China. They say, it's a misconception that China produces cheap goods. We go to China because of the knowledge that exists in China and the quantity of knowledgeable people in sciences, and also the infrastructure which allows us to produce goods and ship them efficiently out of the country. Companies go to China because of cheap labor. It's an absurd idea. Labor is much cheaper in India and in Vietnam and in other countries of the world. I want to explain my investment strategy in China and Hong Kong in a historical context. When China transferred the sovereignty to China, and some Western people still don't understand, Hong Kong belongs to China. No dispute about this. The sovereignty about Hong Kong is China, the state of China. When this happened, I wrote a book about the rise and the fall of cities, and I said that Hong Kong's future was, of course, very different than it had been in the past, because in the past, you had essentially a huge country here, China, and a huge country in the Western world, and Hong Kong was the bridge between these two huge continents. All the traffic went in and out of Hong Kong. When China opened up, the traffic in Hong Kong increased because there were no other bridges. So everybody had to go and cross over to China through Hong Kong. But nowadays, the hundreds of bridges that have been built between Shanghai and the US and Europe, Tianjin and so forth, Nanking, everything is open. And so the importance of Hong Kong has diminished in the context of the world. But in the context of the region of the Greater Bay Area, which is essentially the southern Chinese area around Hong Kong, Guangdong province, Macau, and so forth, Hong Kong is a city that will have 8 to 10 million people in a region of 80 to 100 million people. So it can still be an important city. So whereas I was relatively bearish about properties in Hong Kong for the last 30 years, now the values are very low, relatively speaking, to other countries. And I would invest in Hong Kong property shares. And similar, China was, as you know, the darling of the world for many years, and the media and the journalists all went to China and said, yeah, wonderful, the Chinese can do this and that and this. And now, for the last 4 years, not a single article in the Western media about China, not a single positive. Anyway, the valuations now in China, Hong Kong and China, the market capitalization, this is an area of more than 1 billion people, is lower than the valuation of the magnificent 7 stocks in the US. So I'm saying I'm familiar with problems in China, but I can tell you a lot of the problems in China are exaggerated. And in the US, the problems are kept down. You know, they don't talk about this. In the presidential debate, nobody has addressed the debt and the growing interest payments on the debt and so forth. The important problems are never discussed. Politics is a kabuki theater. I think I'm one of the few very consistent strategists, economists, observers that has always maintained that people should have some physical ownership of gold, silver, and platinum. Now, sometimes this metal will go up at a faster rate than another one and so forth. But in general, as long as central banks exist, you can be sure that there will be money printing. That's the only thing they know. They may have studied at a university, but they haven't read history, or they don't want to say that they know history. Because Greenspan is the last one, the academic, who was very skeptical about what he was doing, but he was doing it anyway because that's the system. He adapted to the system. So he was called the great maestro and so forth. And in this environment, as long as there are central banks in the world, as long as there are governments, precious metals will maintain some of the purchasing power. Now, gold, if I look at the price level when I grew up in 1950s, gold has actually outperformed some items. You know, like gold has gone up more than the price of a loaf of bread. Or gold was at $35 in 1970, now $2,650 or whatnot. So I can say the gold price has gone up actually more than some buildings have gone up. Certainly commercial buildings lately in the US. I have to laugh because all I hear is they will never let anything go down because they can print money. Well, in commercial properties, they could print as much money as they like and prices collapsed.
Absolutely.
Except the collapse was cushioned by the government renting space and space which they actually don't need. You know, when you look at the expansion of the healthcare sectors, it's not an expansion of knowledgeable doctors that do something, administrators. The expansion in the education department is not teachers that teach something intelligent. No. Administrators.
IRS
People who never worked in their lives, they go and tell entrepreneurs how to run their businesses. In general, I feel that the US is very overvalued compared to the rest of the world. So if something is very overvalued, by definition, something must be undervalued. I think precious metals are still reasonably priced. They're no longer that cheap. But some emerging economies are very cheap, and some stocks in emerging economies are very cheap. So I think there is an opportunity, to reduce positions in the US and to move elsewhere. Malaysia was not discussed for 5 years. And I also wondered, why do people avoid Malaysia? It's a country that functions reasonably well. I mean, it's not one of the most popular countries in the world, but it functions well. And I invested over the last 3 years in Malaysia, and suddenly this year it went up strongly. So I think you have to have part of your asset allocation in neglected assets. In other words, things that are overlooked by the media, that are overlooked by the portfolio managers. Because the portfolio managers are nowadays like momentum investors. So they jump into whatever moves. They have no clue about Bitcoin, but they jump into it because it goes up. So because it goes up, it's good.